Now, across Africa, young people are putting their respective governments and long-time leaders on notice. They are standing up to abuses of power and expressing their disapproval through protests. But at what cost? Africa 54's Paul Ndiho has our report.
In its annual report, Human Rights Watch says violent government crackdowns against dissent shaped Africa's human rights landscape in 2018. Government leaders often bullied peaceful protesters, political opponents, human rights defenders, and civil society organizations, while suppressing freedoms of citizens, and in some cases, killings. For example, in the wake of violent protests over massive fuel price hikes in Zimbabwe, the government imposed unlawful restrictions and bans on peaceful protests.
The reports of serious human rights abuses, including beatings, abductions, torture, and the involvement of ZANU-PF, the ruling ZANU-PF party groups, in beating up people in the high-density suburbs around Harare.
Throughout the region, people were denied their right to peacefully protest through unlawful bans, use of excessive force, harassment, and arbitrary arrests. The right to freedom of assembly was the exception rather than the rule, as young people advocated for democratic values. Doug Ferry, a Zimbabwean rights activist, says that democracy cannot just be about the majority towards those who did not vote for the ruling party.
In terms of democracy, what's important is the balance of power, the institutions. Do we have strong institutions? What can the elected officials get away with? If the executive does something blatantly bad, can the parliament hold them to account and pull them up short?
In Sudan, demonstrations are calling for President Omar al-Bashir to step down continue. The armed government protests first erupted in mid-December over inflation and soaring food and fuel prices. Human Rights Watch says that the protection of democratic values, self-determination, and freedoms are being challenged every day.
If you're an autocrat, it's very convenient to violate human rights. It's the way you stay in power. It's the way you fill up your bank account. It's the way you pay off your cronies. So there are reasons why governments want to violate human rights.
Attacks on freedom of speech are seemingly at an all-time high as democracy is continuously being challenged instead of being perfected, according to Vanda Feller-Brown, a senior fellow on foreign policy at Brookings Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based non-profit organization devoted to independent research and policy solutions.
Having an informed public requires freedom of media, freedom of speech, but it also requires access to media and assets, and it requires that people have the physical space to concentrate on something other than their survival.
Vanda says in some African countries you have long-time leaders exploiting ambiguities in the law to extend their terms in office, while simultaneously undermining the nation's constitution.
Elections, regular elections, with defined time frames, whether it's 4 years or 5 years, are a crucial facet of a democracy. And I would say presidential term limits are a crucial facet of democracy. And it's something that's very much contested around the world, certainly throughout Africa. There has been a lot of movement to abolish term limits and change constitutions.
As some African administrations clamped down on dissenters, they became more emboldened to attack traditional media and social media too, including blocking the internet and text messaging services. Paul Ndiho, VOA News, Washington.